The air raid siren wailed in the dark Parisian night, echoing through the abandoned hospital ward. Jeanne Whitley pulled her nurse's cape tighter around her shoulders, counting the wounded men under her care as the building trembled. 5 Americans, 3 British, 1 Canadian, and 2 French resistance fighters, all in various states of recovery, all terrified. "Everyone under your beds," she commanded in French, then repeated it in her native English. "Quickly now." Jeanne had volunteered for the Red Cross in 1939, certain that medical neutrality would shield her from the worst of war's horrors. How naive she had been. 2 years serving in a Paris hospital had taught her that war spared no one, not children, not medics, not even the innocent. War was indiscriminate in its cruelty, and love was a luxury no one could afford, especially not an American nurse surrounded by Nazi occupation. The walls shook as bombs fell in the distance. Dust rained from the ceiling onto her shoulders, and Jeanne forced herself to remain calm as she dropped to her knees, crawling between the beds to check on each patient. She had learned to steel herself against attachment. The wounded men came and went, some to recovery, others to graves. Caring too deeply only broke your heart 100 times over. "Will they hit us, miss?" asked a young British soldier, his bandaged eyes rendering him blind to the chaos. "No," she lied gently. "The Red Cross emblem protects us." Another lie she told herself daily. The emblem on the roof hadn't protected the children's ward in Lyon last month. The bombing intensified, and Jeanne closed her eyes, whispering a prayer that had become as routine as breathing. Not for survival, she had accepted her mortality long ago, but for strength. Strength to remain detached. Strength to do her duty without breaking. Strength to ignore the aching loneliness that threatened to consume her in the quiet hours between air raids. When morning came, Jeanne emerged from the hospital to assess the damage. The street was a maze of rubble and broken glass. A military truck with Nazi markings had parked outside, and officers were directing the unloading of wounded German soldiers. "Fraulein," called a stern voice. "This hospital will now accommodate German soldiers as well." Jeanne bit back her immediate protest. The hospital was already overcrowded. "We have limited supplies," she replied in careful German. "Your objection is noted," the officer said coldly. "But irrelevant." Jeanne watched helplessly as stretchers bearing wounded enemy soldiers were carried past her. Her supervisor, Madame Beaufort, appeared at her side, her weathered face grim. "Tend to them as you would our own," Madame whispered. "Remember your oath." "They're the enemy," Jeanne replied, her voice barely audible. "They are men in pain. Nothing more, nothing less." Jeanne reluctantly followed orders, directing the placement of German wounded in the East Wing, as far from the Allied soldiers as possible. The last stretcher contained a pale officer, his uniform stained with blood from a chest wound. Despite his pain, his blue eyes were alert, watching her with an unsettling intensity. "Your German is excellent," he said quietly in accented English. "But your eyes betray your thoughts, nurse." Jeanne stiffened. "I have no thoughts beyond my duty," she replied coldly. "That is a convenient lie we all tell ourselves," he murmured, before losing consciousness. That night, Jeanne couldn't sleep. The German officer's words haunted her. She had built walls around her heart, convinced that emotional distance was the only way to survive. Yet his statement had cut through her defenses with surgical precision. The next morning, she was assigned to the German ward. The wounded officer's chart identified him as Captain Karl Friedman, Luftwaffe. His injuries were severe, shrapnel had narrowly missed his heart. As she changed his bandages, he awakened. "The Angel of Paris," he said softly. "That's what they call you." "I'm no angel, Captain," she replied tersely. Just a nurse doing her job. And I'm just a pilot doing mine, he countered. Does that comfort you? To think of me as simply the enemy rather than a schoolteacher from Dresden who quotes Goethe and collects jazz records. Jeanne's hands faltered. Your personal life is not my concern. No. His eyes held hers. Then why do I see such conflict in yours, Nurse Whitley? She jerked back. How do you know my name? Your name tag, he said with the ghost of a smile. I'm wounded, not blind. As the weeks passed, Jeanne found herself inexplicably drawn to Karl's bedside. Despite her resistance, their conversations became a strange refuge. He spoke of Dresden before the war, the opera house, the gardens, his students. She found herself sharing memories of Boston, sailing on the Charles River, autumn in New England, her interrupted medical studies. I wanted to be a doctor, she admitted one quiet evening. The war changed everything. The war changes all of us, Karl replied, his voice tinged with regret. But not always for the worse. Sometimes it strips away pretense. And sometimes it creates new ones, she countered. Like enemies who speak as friends. Karl's gaze was steady. Is that what we are, Jeanne? Enemies pretending to be friends. She had no answer. In April 1942, Karl was scheduled for transfer to a German military hospital. The night before his departure, Jeanne found him standing by the window of the ward, gazing at the stars visible between the blackout curtains. You shouldn't be up, she scolded. My last night in Paris, he said simply. I wanted to remember it. There will be other nights in Paris. After the war. Karl turned to her, his expression solemn. Will there? For me? The unspoken truth hung between them. If Germany lost, he might never see Paris again. If Germany won, what would become of her? The future was as uncertain as their feelings for each other. Here, he said suddenly, pressing something into her hand. My address in Dresden. When this madness ends, if you wish to write. Jeanne should have refused. Taking the address of a German officer could be seen as collaboration. But she carefully folded the paper and slipped it into her pocket. I may not write, she warned him. But you might, he replied. And in war, possibilities are precious things. After Karl's departure, Jeanne threw herself into her work with renewed fervor. She would not allow herself to think of him, a German, an enemy, a man whose kindness and intellect had breached her carefully constructed walls. Yet at night, alone in her tiny apartment, she found herself unfolding his address, tracing the neat handwriting with her fingertip. In June, she made her decision. Using the Red Cross courier system, which occasionally passed through neutral Switzerland, she sent a single postcard with a view of Notre Dame. On the back, she wrote only, "The gargoyles still watch over Paris. J." Weeks later, a letter arrived, routed through Switzerland and Portugal before reaching her hands. Inside was a pressed Edelweiss flower and a brief note, "The flowers still bloom in the mountains. One day, they will bloom again in peace. K." Their correspondence became a lifeline in the darkening days of war. Carefully coded messages, inconsequential to censors but laden with meaning for them. They never spoke directly of love or longing, but it infused every word. Jeanne kept his letters in a tin box beneath a loose floorboard, reading them by candlelight during air raids. In November 1943, the letters stopped. The Allied bombing of German cities had intensified, and Dresden was a target. Jeanne continued writing, sending her letters into the void, hoping they might reach him, yet fearing the worst. Then came D-Day, and Paris erupted in celebration as Allied forces liberated the city in August 1944. Jeanne watched American tanks roll down the Champs-Élysées, her heart both soaring and breaking. Victory meant survival, but it also meant Karl was now definitively on the losing side, if he was alive at all. As the war in Europe approached its final months, Jeanne received orders to return to the United States. The Red Cross was rotating personnel, sending experienced nurses home as new volunteers arrived to assist with reconstruction. She packed her meager belongings, including Karl's letters, preparing to leave the city that had been her home through the darkest days of the century. The night before her departure, a French resistance fighter she had once treated for gunshot wounds appeared at her door. "Mademoiselle Whitley," he said urgently. "I have been asked to give you this." He pressed a sealed envelope into her hand. "From Switzerland." The man who sent it said it was a matter of life and death. Inside was a letter written in Karl's familiar hand, dated 3 weeks earlier. "My dearest Jeanne, I write in desperate haste. Dresden is gone, destroyed in the February bombings. I survived only because I was in Berlin on military duties. My family, my home, everything is ash. I am being sent to the Eastern Front, a death sentence in all but name. Before I go, I must tell you what I have kept silent all these months. Your letters saved me. Not just my spirits, but my very life. Each one reminded me that even in war's darkest hours, humanity persists. You taught me that borders exist on maps, not in hearts. If you receive this, know that I have deserted. I could no longer serve a cause I no longer believe in. I am attempting to reach Switzerland with the help of those who, like me, have seen enough of death. If I succeed, I will wait for you at the Café du Lac in Geneva on the first day of each month at noon, for as long as I can. The war will end soon. Germany is defeated. And when peace comes, remember that I loved you before I knew what love could be. Always." Karl. Jeanne's hands trembled as she read the words again and again. Desertion meant execution if he was caught. The Eastern Front meant almost certain death. Switzerland meant hope, slim, fragile, but real. She made her decision in an instant. The next morning, instead of reporting to the ship that would take her home, Jeanne requested reassignment to the Red Cross mission in Switzerland. Her experience and language skills made her request plausible, though her superior officers were puzzled by her sudden change of heart. "America has waited this long, it can wait a little longer," she told them. Geneva welcomed her with a peace that seemed almost obscene after years in occupied Paris. The lakes were blue, the streets undamaged, the people well fed. Switzerland's neutrality had spared it the ravages that had torn apart its neighbors. On May 1, 1945, Jeanne sat at the Café du Lac, watching the door as each customer entered. Noon came and went. The waiter asked 3 times if she wished to order more than coffee. By 3 o'clock, her hope began to fade. By 5, she prepared to leave. "Perhaps June," she murmured to herself, laying coins on the table. As she stood, a commotion at the door caught her attention. A man entered, thin and haggard, his civilian clothes hanging loose on his frame. He scanned the café with desperate intensity. Jeanne froze, her heart thundering in her chest. He was thinner, older, with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow that hadn't been there before. But his eyes, those blue eyes that had first challenged her in a Paris hospital, were unchanged. "Karl," she whispered. He turned at the sound of his name, and their eyes met across the crowded café. For a moment, neither moved, as if fearing the other might vanish. Then Karl crossed the room in long strides, stopping just short of touching her. "You came," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I wasn't sure I got your letter. 3 days before I was to sail home." His hands, once steady enough to pilot aircraft, now trembled as they hovered near hers. "The war is ending," she finished. "Germany surrendered yesterday." Something like relief washed over his face. "Then it's over." "Not for us," Jeanne said, finally allowing her fingers to intertwine with his. "For us, it's just beginning." 2 days later, they stood together on a hillside overlooking Lake Geneva, the spring sun warm on their faces. Karl had told her everything: his gradual disillusionment with the Nazi regime, his secret work passing intelligence to the resistance, his harrowing escape through Bavaria into Switzerland with false papers. "I don't know what comes next," he admitted. "A German officer has few prospects in a world that will rightly condemn what my country has done." Jeanne squeezed his hand. "We'll go to America. Start fresh." "Will your family accept a German? After all that's happened?" "They'll accept the man who kept me human during inhuman times," she said firmly. "The man whose letters crossed oceans and Frontlines to reach me. The man I love." Karl's expression softened, and he pulled her gently into his arms. Around them, wildflowers swayed in the breeze, nature's indifference to human conflict somehow comforting in its constancy. "I once believed that war revealed our true nature," Karl said quietly. "That it stripped away civilization to expose the savage beneath. But you proved me wrong, Jeanne. War didn't make us enemies. People did. And people, just people, made us love each other instead." Jeanne rested her head against his chest, hearing the steady beat of his heart. "In Paris, I told myself that love was a luxury in wartime. That attachment meant certain heartbreak." "And now?" he asked. She looked up at him, seeing not the uniform he had once worn nor the enemy she had been taught to fear, but simply the man who had reached across every boundary to find her. "Now I know that love isn't a luxury," she said. "It's the only necessity." 1 week later, they boarded a train to Paris, a city already beginning to heal its wounds. From there, they would take a ship to America, carrying nothing but their letters, their memories, and their hard-won understanding that humanity could survive even the darkest chapter of history. In a world being reborn from ashes, their love, the improbable, impossible, yet undeniably real, was proof that not everything beautiful had been destroyed by war.